afternoon, everybody. It's great to see you all here and this room very packed out. Sorry about the slightly late start. There's always a technology kind of slowness to things. We've got a wonderful afternoon planned for you with three fantastic speakers. I'll introduce them very briefly and then we'll launch into Duma's presentation. So, first is Duma Gqubule, who is the director of the Center for Development and Economic Transformation, and also an associate at SWAP, who has been conducting research on transformation in the mining industry and has drafted a quite an explosive report and wants to put the cat among the pigeons, I'd say. He's going to present the results of his research and his ideas about real economic transformation in the mining sector. Then we have Carol Paton on my left, Deputy Editor of Business Day, who is a long-standing reporter, correspondent, writer on the left, cut her teeth on labor reporting for Business Day and other journals and publications, and now writes some of the most astute political analysis in this time of crisis in South Africa. And she will be one of the respondents to Duma's presentation. And then the third speaker, who had to go out, he was talking to the president. Now I assume that's not the current sitting, what do you call it, the currently sitting president of South Africa, but a different one. So Mbuyiseni Ndlozi, who is a brilliant PhD student who is just about to or has just handed in his PhD, Member of Parliament, spokesperson for the EFF, and also, after the recent march, I think can be celebrated as the singer-in-chief of our nation, singing about rescuing the African continent with the bazooka, with 100,000 marchers behind it. In fact, just as I was coming to the seminar, I heard singing and I thought, well, you know, this is the EFF bringing Mbuyiseni to the gathering. Actually, it wasn't. It was a Christian gathering, and they were singing that Jesus is their only leader. So that was a bit of a diversion on my way to this afternoon. But without any further ado, if I can just hand over to Duma, he will have about 30 minutes. Each respondent will have about 10 minutes, and then it's over to you to the floor.
Thank you, Carl. At the weekend, we're talking about singing. At the weekend, I had nothing better to do. I was listening to the president make a speech at Mbuyiseni, and he was singing at the end of it. And for a minute, I thought he was singing better than the EFF guy. So I was just wondering who's better. Anyway, I don't know where to start. First of all, I have to thank the people at SWAP for inviting me here to talk about this topic that's become quite important to me. And Gavin, I met for Gavin. Carl, I knew through your writings, some amazing work that you've done on health and what happened during the late 90s and early 2000s with the GEAR program and the impact that it had on our health. And I thought it was amazing work that you did. And Carl, I've met since 2010 when we started speaking at all these, Gavin, when we started speaking at all these mining conferences, yeah. So basically what I want to say is that, I must get the time, where's the phone? Is that, where do I start? Because I'm in a university, I thought I should start by talking about fees must fall. I don't want to take away from what I want to talk about, but just for a short minute here. I felt strongly about this and I've thought about it for quite a long time. So I've got two quotes here from, what I want to say about this fees must fall is that, you know, back in the day I used to have an office in Killarney and I would meet Mary Metcalf, who was the DG of higher education there in Moore, and we talk now and again, and then I'd say to her, but Mary, just explain to me, what is difficult in making tuition fees? I really don't get it. It's one of the easiest things to do. Duma, we don't have education economists. And anyway, so my sister spoke to a member of the top 6 of the ANC, and he, so you can already do your calculations, told her that, Pumla, let me tell you the truth. The truth is that we, as the ANC, we have never applied our minds to the issue. And given all the priorities that we have now, we'll probably never ever apply our minds to this issue. So what I want to say is that I see a lot of parallels that are happening with what happened in the ANC in 2010 when they set up a commission to look into the whole issue of nationalization. And what's happening now, the commission, I think, is meant to just demobilize all of you. So what I want to say quickly about fees must fall is that there's a quote here by the guy called Wilbur Cohen who started Social Security in the US. And he says a program that only deals with the poor would end up being a poor program. And if there's nothing in it for the middle income and upper income Americans, in the long run, it is a program that the American people will not support. And then one from, so he says it's a lousy, programs for the poor have been lousy, no good poor programs. And then Paul Krugman, he talks about means testing. And he says the usual argument against means testing, which is entirely valid, is that number 1, it doesn't save much money. Number 2, it messes up a relatively simple program. And the reason it can't save money is that there are relatively few people who are rich enough to be able to afford major cost sharing. So I've thought about this thing for a long time. I've thought that my view now is that I don't think the easiest way to do this thing is not to have any market mechanisms involved in providing higher education. And the more complicated a proposal is, the more likely it is for someone to have, to create a profit for people. So I just think that I believe in a decommodified model of provision of higher education. And the reason for it, I asked that say to give me statistics to show how many people earn more than 600,000. So this is the figures they had to go and dig up for me. So it's black Africans, 1.7%, in households where it's more than 600,000. Coloreds is 6.2%. I don't like these terms, I have to call it. But anyway, Indian, 16.6%, and white South Africans, only a third. So 2/3 of South Africans are below that cutoff. So the people who need it most, the people, for example, in the historically black universities, what you'll find is that there's nobody to collect fees from. So my view is that let's make it free, and I believe that it's only 21 billion. And I don't think we should allow the ANC governments to divide you by saying for the deserving poor. And that is one criticism I have of the EFF's position, because it involves taking fees from the rich. Just what I'm saying. Anyway, that's another issue. So 7 years ago, I became interested in this mining issue. I was approached by a gentleman called Eric Yemi, and he asked me to become involved in something called Mining for Change. And the first question I thought to myself is, why do we bother about mining? It's a sunset industry. I was thinking, like most South Africans, what it is. But over the time, I became very involved in the whole issue of the mining industry in 2010, and when there was the whole issue of the nationalization debate. And I was asked by the South African Mining Development Association to do some research into the whole issue of nationalization. So during that period, I think the EFF people who were then in the ANC, they picked up that there's this guy who's sort of on our side, so let's invite him to talk to us. So I addressed the ANC Youth League, I addressed maybe more than once or twice, and then we talked about these issues, and also addressed the ANC's Economic Transformation Committee. And what I'm trying to say is that, so I became to understand that mining is different. Because natural resources should be treated differently from other sources of wealth in the economy. They're not created by the efforts of those who own the land. In most countries, private property owners, including communities, do not have the rights to the mineral resources because of the fortuitous fact that they're located beneath your property. So the extraction renders them unavailable to others, including later generations. So the resources owner, the state on behalf of the people, must be compensated royalties. So in many countries, mining is publicly owned in most countries. And in 2011, a study was done by Eco Partners, and they found that the mineral endowment then was worth 4.7 trillion, which is equivalent to 1 million rands per citizen. Obviously, the prices have come down, and the figures are probably half of that here. So the state, therefore, must develop and manage natural resources in a manner that extracts maximum benefits for its citizens. There has to be a public benefit, in addition to normal tax revenues that apply to other industries, which are not publicly owned, in addition to BE requirements, which apply in all other industries, which are not publicly owned. The problem in the mining sector is that the BE requirements are significantly lower than the targets for transformation that apply in the other sectors of the economy. And I will talk about that a lot. So what I've learned over the years, I've done lots of work for Mistra. I can see people from Mistra here. I've done work for Action Aid. I've done country case studies, all over the world. In terms of Europe, in terms of Latin America, and most African countries. Yeah. But so it has to be located within a national vision for economic growth and development, the strategy on mining, and a national vision for natural resources. There has to be state capacity to lead the sector. And then the government must develop measures, it's called the government take system, to extract a fair share of natural resource rents. And we must develop measures to manage the natural resource rents and invest them, and obviously diversify the economy away from natural resources. And the National Vision for Growth and Development, and this is just a summary of how it works, in my view, after many years of looking at it. There has to be a mobilizing vision and plan, and countries like Japan, Malaysia, Ethiopia, they've got very convincing ones. There has to be the state capacity to initiate the growth. There has to be human capital upgrading on a massive scale, and also industrial upgrading. And also macroeconomic policy uses a wider range of policy tools than what Keynes envisaged, where it was just monetary and fiscal policy. So you have multiple tools, and you have multiple targets and multiple objectives. So I believe that the inflation targeting system that we have, one target, one tool, is primitive. It requires the close coordination of monetary, fiscal, and industrial policies. And this is, my view, the implications for the independence and mandates of the central banks. So I just want to talk about the current situation in terms of the economy. People misunderstand it. The global financial crisis was largely a rich country affair. No developing country had a banking crisis. And what happened in the developing countries is that they had expansionary monetary and fiscal policies to compensate for the collapse in export revenues to rich countries. Yeah. So what we had in South Africa, our GDP went down 1.5%, we lost 1 million jobs. In all developing countries, the growth was 2.4%, in East Asia 5.1%, in Africa it was 2.3%. More than 40 African countries grew. Ethiopia, Nigeria grew faster after the global financial crisis than it did before. China, India, Indonesia, and Egypt, they all grew during 2009. Why did South Africa not grow? So in South Africa, what happened? Strange thing happened. The central bank started increasing interest rates by 250 basis points before the global financial crisis, and unbelievably increased interest rates after the global financial crisis by 250 basis points. And work that was done at the time by Chris Madikane, he showed that the South African downturn preceded the global financial crisis by, I think, 9 quarters. And he attributed about 70% of the downturn that we saw at the time to domestic factors here. So guess what's happened since then? So what we've seen since January 2014 is that the Reserve Bank again has increased interest rates by 200 basis points, and despite a massive increase in unemployed people. And the Reserve Bank has been implicated in causing the last 2 recessions and the current downturn. So basically the problem that we have in South Africa is that we've had low growth of 1.6%, 0.4% per capita for 8 years. And that is, so now if you compare it with what's happening in the rest of the world, the emerging markets, 153 countries, they grew by 5%. Emerging Asia, 7.4% over the same period. Sub-Saharan Africa, 4.4%. And if you look at Sub-Saharan Africa, the growth has dropped. And the main reason because of the recessions in South Africa and Nigeria, which account for 50% of the the economies of sub-Saharan Africa. So what you can see there, we have underperformed against every region in the world. Even if you look at countries that are currently in recession like Brazil, over the 8-year period, we've underperformed against them. Yeah. So what we have now is a crisis of collapsing GDP growth and rising unemployment. Unemployment has increased by 3 million people since December 2008. There are now 9 million unemployed South Africans, 41% for black Africans. And despite fear-mongering by the rating agency, we do not have a debt problem. We have a GDP growth problem. A rising debt to GDP ratio is the side order that comes with collapsing GDP growth. Yeah. So our debt to GDP ratio is still 50%. It's still low if you compare with OECD countries. And if you compare with the rich countries, which are sitting at 105% of GDP. So South Africa is not broke. So when we talk about, fees must fall, what is affordable, you must get out of your head the fact that maybe we are broke. And then there's all this talk, a slogan, structural reforms. There is no link that has ever been established between structural reforms and growth in the short term. In its 2012 World Economic Outlook, the IMF conceded that structural reforms have a cost in the short term, and because they have a cost in the short term, I don't think we should be thinking about that now. So a quote from these debates in economics have been happening for a long time. So Keynes said, "You will never balance the budget through measures which reduce the national income. That is austerity and fiscal consolidation." And he says, if you look after unemployment, the budget will look after itself. So that is my view on this whole issue. And I believe that with the downgrade, what we should have done is to have an immediate escape clause for the Reserve Bank. What happens in these issues, when you have a potential negative shock to your economy, what happens, whether it's in Brexit, whether it's in whatever country, the first thing that happens is that the Reserve Bank cuts interest rates and creates more liquidity in the system, and they implement expansion of fiscal policy. So if you look at so I believe really we should be having a fiscal stimulus of 3% of GDP, 400 billion over 3 years, and there are various ways in which you can do it. A populist is someone who doesn't tell you how they will pay for it, and if you really want to push me on this one, I can explain how we can pay for it. Yeah. So the vision for natural resources, the best known one is from Norway. They had something called the 10 Commandments in 1970 with a set of instructions that were given to Parliament in terms of how they would manage their oil wealth. There has to be state capacity to lead the sector. There's regulatory capacity. In Norway, it's the best practice models in Norway, where you have a separation of the policy, the regulatory, and the commercial functions. And in Nigeria, they've mixed up these things, but they're now trying to adopt the Norwegian model. And then there's also the whole issue of extractive capacity. And then you have to extract a fair share of natural resource rents. Now, in between the false dichotomies between nationalization and privatization, there's so many ways of slicing the rent as there are countries in the world. Each model is unique. There are various combinations of equity, tax regimes, contract types, and various means of paying. The money doesn't have to be paid up front or at all. You can pay up on commercial terms, carrying equity interest, and so forth. So the research I did at the time, state equity trumps tax revenues, especially during the recent boom. It can't be off the table. It's popular because the population can see the benefits of the industry. Secondly, a state-owned company can appropriate all the rents in a company. For example, in Saudi Arabia, in Mexico for 75 years until 2013, and in Brazil for 4 years until 1997. You can't develop tax systems that replicate government tax systems in Norway and Botswana and Venezuela. Beyond a certain level of tax, there will be no investors, obviously. So the key issues are well known in terms of managing the natural resource lens and the Dutch disease. And a resource country has to have a view on the exchange rate. And obviously, we must invest in infrastructure, human capital, and diversification. And there's a whole issue of sovereign wealth funds, which I'll talk about later, but it can be taken to extreme when you have rich countries that are poor. For example, Timor-Leste, which accumulated all this money in the sovereign wealth fund while the people of Timor-Leste became poorer. And obviously, there's the whole issue of diversification in the economy, and these are the things that you find in the African mining vision that you've done a lot of work on. And then downstream linkages, upstream linkages, and side stream linkages. So now I want to talk quickly about the mining charter. You will remember that at the time it appeared revolutionary, but now it looks very primitive. It does not address the direct government take, excluding US, Canada, and Australia, which follow the Anglo-Saxon model of capitalism. Most of the top 20 mining countries in the world have a direct government take. In Africa, DRC, Zambia, Ghana, Mali, Burkina Faso, Ethiopia, Guinea, Gabon, and Zimbabwe have a direct government take. And a big thing was that there was no targets for communities and workers. And at the end of last year, I was in a conference in Dar es Salaam by parliamentarians and ministries of mining across the continent. And the number one issue there at the conference was the issue of community participation in mining. And it was overtaken by the measurement, advances in the measurement of BE, which are contained in the codes. All the commitments made by stakeholders in the charter were vague. There were no numeric targets for most indicators. There was no measurement system and scorecard with clear definitions. There was no system to monitor implementation. There was no independent verification of the BE contributions. Mining is the only sector of the economy that doesn't have to have a BE scorecard. And there were disturbingly low targets for employment equity and black women. The analysis I did at the time is that the targets they set had already been achieved because of the overwhelming representation of white women in management levels. So there were no targets for black people, black women, black disabled people, black-owned companies, and black women-owned companies. It is a shambles of a document that betrays from start to finish all the principles of true empowerment. And in terms of ownership, the big issue was the inability to monitor and measure net value. And so the mining companies, when you sign a transaction, they believe that that is the achievement of the target. In the rest of the economy, ownership is a process, not an event. So you have, there's a formula in the codes of good practice that allows you to earn your net value points over 10 years. So this is, so we've now got a big problem with the mining charter. There's a court case with the Chamber of Mines. The Chamber says they've achieved 38% compliance and transferred value of 150 billion. And there's no continuing obligation after you get a mineral right. If the black shareholders sell their shares, you don't have to replace the equity. In other words, there must be once empowered, always empowerment. They say they've got no obligation to sell to employees and communities. And the fact that share prices fell, resulting in under-the-water transactions, should not be held against the mining companies. They say that there is no obligation to transfer net value, and a perpetual 26% target will destroy investor confidence. The government positions, I must talk about this. The government came out with a study, and they weighted their figures with employment. Now, this is beyond belief, and it's not worth presenting the figures because it's just going to create confusion. Yeah. So the new mining charter does not address any of the weaknesses of the charter. It reads like the assignment of a grade 9 learner. So I was trying to think, if my son who's in grade 9 was given an assignment to come up with a charter for the sector, I think he would do a better job. Yeah. So the industry position, I'm comparing the industry position with the BE codes. So in the BE codes, ownership is a moving target calculated on the date of measurement. There is a 25% perpetual target. In the rest of the economy, it has not destroyed investor confidence. In fact, it has created certainty in the rest of the economies. The BE codes have got a compromise position called the once empowered, always empowered, almost empowerment principle. The deputy president called me a month ago, and he was asking me, what's my views on this thing? He says, Duma, what's the true correct figure? Is it 3%? Is it what? So I had to explain these things to him. So companies can, so I said, listen, the solution is in your own policies. It's something called the continuing consequences principle that allows you to recognize 40% of the points after the exit of black shareholders, and it's a temporary situation that gives you enough time to get a new transaction. So in the rest of the economy, companies accept that the target refers to net value, and the codes have a clear obligation to transfer net value. Now, quickly about ownership, it's a very emotional subject. After 300 years of colonialism, there have been calls for radical economic transformation, nationalization without compensation and reparations. And as I said, the natural resources should be publicly owned. They do not belong to the multinationals who mine them. They belong to us as South Africans. So there has to be a public benefit, as I said. There has to be public ownership. There has to be a free carry portion for the state, communities, and workers. And it's very difficult to achieve. I believe it should get more attention, not less. And we must embrace a broad definition of ownership, includes shares, property, land, household assets. So if we continue a bit, so in ownership of all asset classes depends on the level of interest rates and GDP growth. In South Africa, we've had punitive, usurious interest rates. Inflation targeting has impeded capital accumulation. For resources sector, we need a view on the currency, and the exchange rate is critical. All the time that I've spent analyzing this theme of ownership, the most important impediments are at the macroeconomic level. So it's a macroeconomic level, high interest rates and low GDP growth. And there's also the whole issue of the ownership of the banks and the influence over finance capital, the poor design of the mining charter. There's also the whole issue that's happening in the financial sector charter, where there's also trying to present lobbying for the whole issue of once empowered, always empowered. So this is just quickly to show real interest rates in South Africa until the global financial crisis were about 9% on average, and the growth rate was about 3%. So obviously the deals will not make money. And now, Carol, and there's a lot of fake BE statistics here. Now these are the real figures. Okay. So I saw in Parliament, so I'm first going to talk about white monopoly capital at the level of the whole economy, and then later at the level of the mining sector. Now, in Parliament, let me tell you, the Nedbank says there's 36% black ownership. First Rand says there's 33% black ownership. It can't be. So I decided, I was presenting at the BE Commission about 2 weeks ago, so I decided to do statistics on the top 40 JSE companies. They account for 80% of the market cap on the JSE, and you will see here that there's 10.8 trillion of the market cap of those companies. It's about 80% of the JSE. Now, this is the BE market capitalization. It's 1.2%. Now, let me just make one point clear. There is a study by the JSE that says there's 23% black ownership. I just got a call now from the Mail and Guardian. She's doing a story on this study. Now, this study found that there is 10% direct and 23%. Now, the thing is, white privilege is a very good thing, because you can release a 4-page press release, and it is now taken as the truth, and it is repeated ad nauseum, but you don't show anything about how you arrived at my figures. So you can look at every single thing here and say, Duma, this one is wrong. So I just want to highlight some. First Rand is 4.2%, not according to their own annual report. Nedbank is I think it's 2.3%, 1.5%, whatever. Yeah. So now remember, Jacob Zuma said that it was 3%. In the top 40, it's 1.2%, like for like. Now, you will have seen since the downgrade that the stock exchange has gone up, but now the truth of the matter is the stock exchange has got nothing to do with the South African economy. So I saw this article in MoneyWeb last year where they say 70% of the revenues of South African companies are generated outside of South Africa. And it's one of the reasons why the stock exchange has remained fairly resilient despite our such economy. So I decided to go and look at the figures. Now, the JSE, there is 7 companies with a market cap of 1.3 trillion that have got 0 South African assets. They've got nothing to do with South Africa. Those are the companies, usually with a PLC at the end of them. Then I went and calculated the value of the South African assets for each company, which is obviously a very difficult thing. So I looked at the percentage of profits, the percentage of productions for mining companies, single commodity companies, and various methodologies to come and say how much refers to South African assets. Now, the JSE has not done this in their study, and this is one of the weaknesses of the JSE study. And so what we find is that 28% of what is on the JSE refers to South African assets, and 17 whatever percent refers to foreign assets. So we must now calculate as a percentage of domestic assets, because BE refers to South African assets. So then you must also look at unlisted companies. Now the JSE does not look at unlisted companies. I did look at unlisted companies. I look at Naspers, I look at AB InBev, and the 5 mining companies which sold mines at the level of individual mines. Then the summary situation is that on the top 40, 16 companies sold equity at a listed level, 8 companies sold at an unlisted level, 7 companies had no assets, and 9 companies, the retailers and so forth, had no black ownership. Bidvest has a little bit, but I just decided to put it as no black ownership. So this is the average situation. This is the real figures. Black ownership at the listed level was 1.2, at the unlisted level was 0.7, and as a percentage of GDP, it's 1.9. So percentage of South African assets is 7%, and if you look at the net value of South African assets, it is 3 to 4% here. That is what I believe. So now, let's look at the mining situation. Now, this is the mining situation in December 2014. The market cap was 2 trillion. You know, the ANC had a study where they said that it would cost 1 trillion to nationalize the mines, and it would cost 500 billion to nationalize, to buy 51%. Therefore, they concluded that it was totally unaffordable. And but they didn't look at, they were talking about nationalizing in 1 day. But I don't think anyone was saying we should buy the mines in 1 day. So I'm really surprised that they never looked at the issue of buying them over 10 years. They never said how we could buy them Kaskoloto or something like that, you know, and like a BE deal. Anyway, so then this is the BE market cap. It's 2.8%. And this is the net value. And I'm just going to go through this because I summarized them later on. Yeah. So this is all the detail that you don't really need to know. Level of unlisted companies. This is an interesting one. This is the one that shows how much the government owns in the mines. So the PIC owns 70, and the IDC owns 80 billion rands of the mines. And I just want to show the value of South African assets. It was 2 billion. I calculated the value of South African mining assets for reasons. Okay, so the value of South African assets at the end of December, I came to a figure of 600 billion, the value of South African assets. So by the end of 2015, those assets were worth 300 billion with the collapse of commodity prices. So if you look at this, which is 80 billion rand that the government owns in the mines, it is about 16% of the mining industry. That is what we currently own. So this is the summary situation in terms of ownership. 16% of South African assets, that's the gross value of black ownership. The net value is 9.1%. Now the key issue I should say about the net value is that 81% belongs to 3 companies. 3 companies are African Rainbow Minerals, Exxaro, and the Royal Bafokeng. So it is not even true that all the benefits went to politically connected. Because, let me just explain. There was Tokyo Sekwale, he sold all his shares in 2011 and he exited the sector. Then there was Cyril Ramaphosa. He had some investment, but the biggest one was an investment in an iron ore company called ASO, where they sold it to the community and the workers and made a profit of 2.7 billion. It sounds like a lot of money for one company, but in terms of the whole industry, it's not that much. So employee schemes at the end of 2014, 0. Community schemes, 2.2%. Of those community schemes, 90% belongs to 2 companies, the Royal Bafokeng and also Kumba Iron Ore, the community is there. So the key take-home message from this that I saw was that 81% of the benefits went to 3 companies. Now, since then, I was running out of time. In 2016, I did an update. So what's happened in 2016, the gross value of black shareholding has gone down to 9%, and the net value has gone down to 5%. Now, there's 2 reasons for that. Remember, there were 3 black-owned companies. It was African Rainbow Minerals, Exxaro, and Royal Bafokeng. So Royal Bafokeng sold their shares in Impala Platinum. They reduced their shares to invest in finance. And then the second thing that happened is that African Rainbow Minerals is no longer a black-owned company for various reasons. And Exxaro is no longer a black-owned company for various reasons. So those are the 3 reasons why the black ownership has gone down. So the net value in terms of black ownership of the mining industry is 5%. And I just have to address this issue of the Communist Party. They say black people supported nationalization because they wanted their mines to be taken over. So at the time when I did that research, it was shown that is not true, because those three companies, they didn't have debt. So African Rainbow Minerals, the mines from Anglo that they bought in 1998, they were given to them. Well, not given, but almost given. So there was no debt associated with that. Secondly, and Bafokeng, for various reasons, they don't have that much debt, yeah, because they converted a royalty payment into shares. And also, Exaro, they had some debt, but the value of the shares was 20 billion rands more than the debt. So that is the situation in terms of the mining charter. So the vision and the way forward for me, it's half an hour, is that we need to sit down and have a vision for the sector. We have to align this charter with the B codes. We need to have a target of 25% public ownership. Now, people, when I explain this thing to them and why they need it, 90% of people agree, but they say, not this government, but otherwise we agree with you, yeah. So I believe that there should be 7.5% for employees, 7.5% for communities, and to make this thing, there has to be a 50% free carry, and then the 10% must be the other. Now, we should set up a regulatory agency to award mineral rights and monitor implementations. You see, you can't have a situation where the Department of Mineral Resources awards licenses, monitors implementations, and does everything together. We have to separate those things, you know. And then I called for a listed state mining company or sovereign wealth fund to consolidate the government assets, 80 billion rands. So the shortfall between that and the 25% target is about 50 billion rands. So remember, the ANC said it costs 500 billion rands, so the shortfall is far less than they said. Now, the other thing I believe strongly about is that Anglo-American should come back home. There should be a geographic unbundling of Anglo-American. Now, Anglo-American accounts for, I can't remember the figure, about 40% of South African mining assets. When we have a plan for a mining industry, it must be a plan for Anglo-American. That's where it must start. So let me explain this thing. The PIC owns 13% of Anglo. They picked up the shares when they were down. Now, if we have a geographic unbundling, I saw this from an analyst report by Barclays as to how it would work. 50% would relate to South African assets. So we'd separate it in the same way that Investec separated the South African and the non-South African assets, in the same way that Goldfields did that, in the same way that Mondi did that. You know, it happens, it's normal. And so then we'd have Anglo-South Africa. So the government would automatically own 27% of Anglo-American. And then we could add the other elements, which is the community ownership and the employees. And I believe that royalties, you know, we were at the Makufe, and I was trying to explain this to the communities, and I've been involved with them with Gavin for a long time. So 50% of royalties, I believe, should go to community funds, and the governance of the community funds, we must address this issue. 40% of the royalties must capitalize the state mining companies, and I believe 10% of our royalties must be in the agency that will monitor which will award mineral rights and monitor implementation. And obviously we have to sort out this whole issue of once empowered in the mining sector and in the banks. Now, we're talking about radical transformation, but if you don't sort out the issues of once empowered in the mines and the banks, what's going to happen is that people are going to start asking other sectors of the economy, what is the credibility of this policy if the mines and the banks don't have to? So I believe that if we don't sort out this once empowered in these two sectors, it will result in a premature end to BEE deals in all sectors of the economy. So that is my situation. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Duma. We'll organize it again. I'm sure the royalties can pay for the film. Thank you very much. I'm not sure if other people are quite as dizzy with the figures as I am, but I'm sure that our two respondents will be able to sort them out for us as well. So first up, Carol.
everybody. Thanks very much. Thank you to Duma, really, for doing a very, very good piece of work that I think powerfully exposes real achievements or non-achievements of the mining charter. And I think there's a piece of work that puts some serious thought into how to have a fairer and more just mining industry. Now, when I was asked to speak here, I was asked to comment on Duma's report, which I've done. I've read that whole goddamn report, Duma. and I prepared comments on it. But when I was finally sent the invitation, I was alarmed to see that the topic of this talk was white monopoly capital versus radical economic transformation. And I'm hoping that I'm not white monopoly capital, but I'm open to debate. Okay, so firstly, just to comment on the mining charter, and I'm doing this comments on the mining charter. Well, I think the mining charter, the fact that the mining charter failed to transform the industry, I think, is common cause. At the time it was heralded as a transformative document that would induce transformative processes, but I think if you look more closely at it, it wasn't really, in terms of the stakeholders and the people who were involved in formulating that charter, the intention was not transformation. So the intention was a very narrow intention, which was to transfer ownership. And the key debate was about how much, what's the percentage. And the percentage was 26%. So while they came up with a very concrete target for ownership, the mining charter actually said very little about the industry and about workers and about communities and about the fact that mining resources surely should be a public benefit. So when it came to mine community and rural development, the 2002 charter said that the stakeholders would cooperate to formulate an integrated development plan for communities where mining takes place and for major labour-saving areas, with special emphasis on the development of infrastructure. So that was it. No targets, no implementation mechanism. When it came to housing and living conditions, very similar picture. Also, we'll coordinate and we'll commit to improving worker housing and living conditions, but again, no targets. So this is exactly how we came to Marikana after 10 years of the mining charter, where you had a situation where you had a party on its way to being BEE empowered company with Cyril Ramaphosa on the board, and a company which at the end of the day used the same violence that has been used against workers all the way through history. And at the end of the day, all that had changed really for Lonmin was that there was a different set of faces on the board. But in fact, for people who worked there and for labour-saving communities, nothing had changed. So I think that's the kind of key point about the mining charter, is that it really never intended to do any transformation. But I think it raises an interesting point, which I think that Duma kind of cops out of a bit in his paper, which is how important is black ownership. So in his presentation he said he raised the emotional issue, the 300 years of dispossession and so on. But we really have to look at and understand and commit to how important is black ownership of the industry. So we can see that black ownership of the industry hasn't been transformative. So we've had all these transactions, which no one has documented better than Duma has. But what we found, well, what Duma says in his paper, which I think is a very important point, is that BEE is not a public benefit. So no matter how a transaction is structured that will only benefit a minority of South Africans. And that's been the key problem with our role. And I want to just talk a bit about a transaction that I covered in a lot of detail, because it kind of shows up exactly how cynical and how untransformative actually black ownership has been. In fact, it's Chris Marcani who described in his recent paper that's caused all the trouble, BEE as a bribes system. So this transaction I want to talk about is Goldfields. So in 2010, Goldfields needed to do a new BEE deal because Tokyo Safari had exited, and they needed an empowerment partner, and they had a new mine they wanted to develop. And now Goldfields is a very big company. It's the 7th biggest mining company in the world. It's a serious global player. So where were they going to find their BEE partner? Well, after the first sort of phase of BEE, where you saw Sekwale, Cyril Ramaphosa, Saki Mukazoma, all affirmed into these wonderful positions of wealth, there was a kind of reaction against that for people to say, let's actually broaden this out. We can't have deals that go to all the usual suspects. So the instruction given to the CEO of Goldfields, Nick Holland, from the Department of Mineral and Energy Resources was that he's not allowed to use the usual suspects, and his team must include women who were involved in the struggle and people from 7 political parties. So that's how he saw it. Now, it just so happened that Nick Holland had met up somehow along the way with somebody called Gayton McKenzie. Now, he'd met Gayton on some speaking engagement because Gayton was doing some motivational talking. So he thought that Gayton, with his connections to the ANC, could help him put together his BEE consortium. So that's what happened. He asked Gayton to put it together. Gayton says he went to the MKMVA. That was his first port of call, where he asked, who shall this deal go to? And he says he was told that Maleka Mbete is a non-negotiable member of the consortium because she hadn't had a big deal yet. So Mackenzie assembled the consortium, and to Mbete added President Jacobs' lawyer during the rape trial. That was, sorry, I forget his name. No, the other one, Jerome, somebody. Yeah. And Nelson Mandela's granddaughter, Zinzi Mandela, the former NUM president, James Mclatchie, Dimpo Hani, the wife of Chris Hani, the former ANC Treasurer General Nendiam Samang's son, Mandla Samang, the MKMVA president, Kepi Mafatswe, as well as several other individuals. So Goldfields, by the way, kept this list very secret, and they wouldn't release it to anyone until they faced an investigation from the SEC in the US, because they are listed in the US. And then they eventually revealed it. Now, at the time, I was doing some work and speaking to people who were involved in these BE deals and asking them, like, how do you choose your beneficiaries, your participants? And this is what Jay and I do at the time, which Hague was only insisted on being anonymous. But this is a quote that he gave me. He said, core people are put forward by government and by the Tuli House, and you are told that whoever else you want to include in the train is fine, but certain people are non-negotiable. That is why these deals always come back to the politically connected. You have to be mad or naive not to have realized by now that this is how it works. So that's the kind of sort of horrible underbelly, I guess, of the black ownership side. And I'm definitely not advocating there shouldn't be black ownership. I think there must be, there has to be. The question is, what weight do we give it? And how much, really. So I don't know if that's something people might want to in the debate. I think because, my model, or the model that I would sort of choose for or think is a realistic one for the mining industry would be a capitalist model. And I'm sure there's some people here who don't agree with that. But if your model is a capitalist model, then you need to, and your objective is to attract investors and to use private investment and private resources to invest and extract resources, then you do have to give kind of serious consideration to the weight that you give all of these things, such as ownership, such as the free carry, and so on. I think it's a tragedy that South Africa never looked at the free carry model when we started to look at the industry and transformation and the charter. Because I do think that the fundamental point about how you need to, how these mineral resources should in fact be for the public benefit is one in which we've just completely skirted. So the kind of argument that's come from government and from the ANC has been to say, well, we will tax them, and we do tax them, and as a result we then use this tax for redistributive means. But I do think that doesn't solve all your problems. It certainly doesn't solve your problems of impoverishment of mining communities or mine labour-saving communities. And then I think, just exactly as Duma alluded to, he says that when he discusses his model with the free carry and the community ownership and the worker ownership, he gets a response, which is that not this government. Yes, I agree, but not this government. And I do think that is a huge problem. So if we look at now, there's common cause at the moment that the mining license allocation process is corrupt. It's created sort of several levels of rent-seeking opportunities. So you pay all the way through the system. You pay for your water license, you pay for your environmental license, you pay for your mining license, and so on and so forth. And if anyone is interested, the person who's actually in charge at the moment of giving out mining licenses and taking them away is a woman called Sipati Dlamini. Now, Sipati Dlamini was the chief financial officer in the Department of Agriculture in the Free State, and she was very close to Mbuyiseni Ndlozi. And the two of them together gave the Guptas millions of rands for their dairy in the Free State, which went really up, and later all the animals had to be slaughtered. So there's a kind of very fundamental problem with handing over free carry or any greater discretion than already exists to a Department of Mineral Resources that is quite decisively captured by corrupt business people. I also want to raise an issue with the issue of community ownership and the difficulties around that. So if you take the example of Lonmin, the land that Lonmin is owned by the Babo Mahale, and that's their ancestral land, and they have an arrangement in place that the Babo gets royalties from the Lonmin mine. But those royalties are paid to the provincial government, the trust fund in the Northwest provincial government, and in the last 5 years, 500 million has vanished from that fund. If you go to Marikana, go to the ancestral home of the Babo, you can see their village is, yes, it's slightly better than the shacks that the mine workers are living in around it, and they have water and they have some roads. Really, there's no benefit going to that community from those royalties. So that's my kind of response to Duma's paper. I think just to address briefly the question of white monopoly capitalism versus radical economic transformation. I think both these terms are very problematic. I think they both mislead more than they inform. And if we want to describe the sort of gone before as white monopoly capitalism, I guess you can, although it's not a really accurate label. It's rather from an ownership point of view. You're talking about global capital and an alliance with indigenous or emerging capital, in which global capital has not relinquished control and in which indigenous capital has not, in most cases, been able to leverage their wealth to actually put it to work in production. As for radical economic transformation, I actually think that Duma's model gives us a little bit of, with the free carry and the public ownership, I do think it gives us something to think about, something of substance, because I think that a lot of what has been put out there by politicians as to what radical economic transformation actually is, has been very misleading. But I look forward to hearing your thoughts on that. Thanks.
Thanks, Carol, for deepening the critique of what's currently happening in the mining industry. Mbuyiseni, I don't know if you're going to start with a song or not.
Thank you very much. Yeah, also I have written my reaction, or our reaction, what should be interpreted as the EFF's reaction. Look, it's true that the mining charter was a shamble of a document that betrayed from start to finish every principle empowerment that the country had developed over many years. But more importantly, the mining charter made a mockery of the Minerals and Petroleum Resources Development Act passed in 2000. For the first time post-1994, the state was in full control of deciding on the future of mining in the interest of the country, beyond issuing licenses and controlling and collecting revenue. The MPRDA was supposed to facilitate transfer of mineral wealth from few white individuals to broader community through empowerment and social contract. But government failed to first articulate clearly how this will happen, and secondly develop mining charter, including social contract, that it is, if not impossible, difficult to enforce. The mining charter, the report shows clearly that companies have failed to meet all targets from ownership, social and labor contracts to environmental issues. According to the report, between 1997 and 2014, there were 40 BEE transactions, as you saw, almost worth 110 billion within the 25 top JSE listed companies. The report also illustrates that when one takes into account the processes and forms of BEE transactions and how these shares were acquired, it becomes evident that only 3 BEE companies have more than 1% of black ownership in the mining sector. It states that, and I quote, the charter also failed to change the basic structure of the mining industry. At the macro level, the process created 3 relatively large black-owned companies, Exxaro, ARM, and RDH, that controlled mining assets worth 75.3 billion at the end of 2014 December. The report continues and it says, and I think this is really the core of how our discussion should proceed, there has been a reversal of these gains over the past 2 years. Effective net black ownership fell by 50.5% to 28 billion rands, 52% of South Africa's assets, at the end of December 2016 from 57 billion, 9.6% at the end of December 2014. He has already spoken to how the story of that happens. Exxaro and some of the various ways in which these companies began to become unblack. The report has not factored the greatest profit scandal in extractive industries, illicit financial flows. In relation to illicit financial flows, broadly speaking, most empowerment deals, wage negotiations, and social contracts were dependent on profits and dividends. What mining companies do is that they give black people, including the political elite, shares in local companies. Also, all social contracts are binding to local companies, however difficult to enforce they are. Even when workers negotiate for decent wages, the local company becomes the subject of scrutiny to see financials if they can afford such increases. But the local companies will never make profits because parent companies, mostly based in tax havens, are the ones who are declaring serious profits and paying dividends. How this happens is that local companies' expenditure gets inflated mostly by paying services such as marketing, transportation, and consulting to parents' company, including payments of interest on loans that should not be considered as loans to begin with. In many ways, local mining companies are able to claim losses year after year. For an example, BEE shareholders are not paid dividends. Those who have borrowed money to purchase empowerment deals are in serious trouble because the companies that they bought into are not paying dividends, yet they have to pay these loans back. The report, however, and so there has to be a factoring in of this. This is the greatest, most important profit scandal that we have to factor into the public discourse as we think about what has happened to the extractive industries and what should happen moving forward. One of the fundamental reasons why we should take them over is because they have avoided to pay taxes. So then the report makes recommendations, and I want to speak to a few of them. One, what it calls the new vision. The only solution and practical arrangement which will lead to maximum benefit is when the state owns, controls, and mines all its mineral resources. Royalties and taxes and local beneficiation is not going to work because government does not have capacity to enforce many legislation. It's struggling just in education or primary schools. Primary schools. What more with a criminal animal or criminal animals like the extractive industries? Align the mining sector, the report says, to BEE codes. I mean, really, you've just proven to us that BEE must be left behind, yet you return to it. BEE has failed and is proven beyond reasonable, and this is proven beyond reasonable doubt in this report. It benefits a few elite and often politically connected people. In the mining sector, a good example is precisely that only 3 major companies that are black owned have made progress. Develop state capacity to lead the industry. This is a correct proposal. But unlike the report suggests, the kind of capacity required is not to issue mining licenses and monitor the sector. The required capacity is to control, strategize, and do the actual mining. Increase public ownership in the mining industry. This can only happen through nationalization of mines and do away with issuing licenses. Establish a professionally managed South African mining champion. Now, in the presentation, I think I may have missed what you mean here, but I will put this to you, maybe you'll react to it. The report suggests Anglo-American. This is extremely misguided to suggest such an exploitative capitalist could ever put the interest of the country first. There is nothing special about Anglo besides exploitation of South African mineral resources and workers. Its history is dirty, criminal. It has been intimate to the project of a crime against humanity called apartheid, by the way, which leads me to white monopoly capital and radical transformation. They call it radical economic transformation. White monopoly capital, or by white monopoly capital, we have come to mean the dominant white oligopolies, Carol, that have been central to the implementation of apartheid, like in the mining industry, who work together to fix prices, determine state policy, literally function like there's only one person owning and directing in that industry. So they have the effect of monopolies. That's why they've been, the shorthand to it is white monopoly capital. The mining industry in particular has been intimate in the crime against humanity called apartheid through the migrant labor system that was central to racial segregation and the general dehumanization of black people. This is the image of apartheid or colonial capitalism. This is not an emotional issue. You are delegitimizing an actual, correct, and historic occurrence that whose reality still lives today. I think it's wrong for both of you to continue saying this is emotional. It's actually patronizing. A black man and a white woman telling us when we say colonial capitalism and refer to those things as we're being emotional. You have to, both of you, correct that in this platform. It was a crime against humanity. When the Jewish people talk about the Holocaust, you can't say, oh, now we're going to talk about the emotional issue of the Holocaust. Please respect us. A capitalism which maintains and sustains the systematic exploitation of black people to benefit and privilege white people. This proposition of white monopoly capitalism is used to make a projection towards the dismantling not of who owns the economy, but the very fundamental idea of colonial capitalism. It's a left term, it's not the term of liberals. It's historically of the left forces who seek the demise at an international level. And by the way, the international capital you say, or you're calling it global capital, we know that the mining industry started by raising funds in London. It is white. It's white. So it remains, its color is important. Its impact has been racial in this country, and it continues to be. Now, radical economic transformation as an ANC discourse, and at this stage it's merely a discourse that has no policy articulation. You won't find it in any formal policy of the ANC. It's a direct reaction of the ANC to the birth of the EFF as a socialist party in the benches of parliament, and that has resulted to its removal in the major metros. Johannesburg, Tshwane, they are trying to sound like us because they think that is why they are losing power. However, most recently, it has become the slogan of the parasitic political elite grouping in the ANC called the Zuma faction. This faction uses this slogan in its pursuit of naked, mostly represented by two moments. The first moment has happened, the second moment is still going to happen. The first moment was the capture of the treasury by removing Pravin Gordhan and replacing him with Malusi Gigaba. Two, it is the capture of the ANC, which by the way will happen as well in December this year. What is significant here is that for the first time, decisions over the political control of state entities, the political direction of state entities no longer rests on the ANC collective and its different caucuses that are held in most of the cases accountable by elected structures of the ANC. But on the Gupta family, simply because they fund individuals in the ANC. It is the most embarrassing thing, but if you understand the history of the post-colonial state, it was bound to happen in relation to how kleptocratic liberation movements across the continent have become. Simply because the Guptas fund them, the Guptas tell them who should be in the boards of state entities, the boards, and I think it will even come to boards of universities, by the way, because the CT and the government forward people to the university council. But they sit in the compound somewhere called the Gupta compound, and they decide undemocratically. They are not elected. They decide who must be in which board, what decisions must be made, and most recently, they have effected the cabinet reshuffle that made rating agencies declare us into a junk status. Now finally, of course I think that this is an important report that all of us should actually distribute across. It should be made accessible because the mining sector is the fundamental, if you want to understand why capitalism and how capitalism becomes racist and benefits white people at the expense of black people, it's in the story of mining. At the core of which, by the way, is also the origins of Wits University. In Kingdom. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mbuyiseni. So I think we've had three really interesting critiques of the mining industry, but three critiques that in some respects support each other, but in others sharply differ. And I think that it's there that we can start to think and discuss amongst ourselves, interrogate our speakers, and try and push forward our understanding. So now it's really over to you, to the democratic masses of Wits University. So I'll take some few hands and then I'll just decide undemocratically how many hands.